June 1944. France. The forest was a living shadow. Branches like hands, fog hanging in the hollows, the ground littered with the ghosts of battles that had started and stopped a dozen times. The second Rangers pressed forward under orders, maps folded, eyes raw from sleepless nights. They moved like a single body, careful, slow, breathing only when the earth allowed it. Somewhere ahead, automatic weapons set the pace of death, a mechanical metronome that measured out men in seconds. Dustin Ross listened to that metronome and decided to change the tempo. Ross had been a ranger long enough to know the rules and short enough to believe rules were suggestions when lives were on the line. He had seen squads pinned under the same cold pattern of lead, bursts, pause, reload, repeat. He had watched friends swallowed by the silence that followed a failed push. He carried a coil of comm wire in his pack, not because doctrine asked for it, but because he liked the weight of improvisation in his hands. The wires seemed small against the scope of war, but to him it felt like a key. The line halted at the crest of a ridge. Across a narrow valley, German nests stitched through the trees, two belt-fed monsters arranged like teeth in a jaw. Survivors counted the muzzle flashes, counted the timing, trading glances that said the same thing. No way through. Ross crawled forward anyway, belly to the earth, breath held, the smell of cordite and damp leaves filling his nose. He found a mangled MG-42 half buried in the mud, a machine that had given its last breath beside a fallen man. The receiver was torn, the bipod snapped, the feed tray gouged. It was a broken thing that had once been a hurricane. He touched steel and remembered the rhythm. 3 seconds, reload, 3 seconds. He thought of the way the gun moved, the mechanical heart of it, how predictable mechanisms could be persuaded to lie. He pulled the spool of wire from his pack and set to work with hands that were steady because they had to be. No one told him to do it, that was the point. This was forbidden work, the sort whispered about intense because it blurred the line between cunning and madness. But when the line before you is a grave, forbidden can look like salvation. He threaded the wire through the trigger housing, looped it around the sear, anchored the other end to a broken branch. He ran the line back along the ground to where he could pull it from cover. He tested it once. 2 clicks that meant nothing. He tested it again, a sharper metallic sound, and then the gun coughed, a dying throat clearing. For a second, the forest seemed to breathe with him. He wrapped the spool tight around his fist, as if holding the pulse of the thing itself. He crawled back and told his men nothing more than what they needed. When it sings, run. There were no lectures, no plans beyond motion. The Rangers trusted him because they had seen what motion did to panic. They trusted him because fear looked the same on every face, and Dustin had never let fear keep him rooted. He pulled the line. The MG-42 answered like it had been woken from a bad dream. Lead stitched wood and leaf into a ragged curtain. The Germans spun, eyes seeking the source, mouths making the words of confusion. From 100 yards, it sounded like more than one gun. From 100 yards, the enemy could not be sure whether they were being flanked, ambushed, or betrayed by the forest itself. Chaos likes disguise. The Rangers stood moving as Dustin's wire fed fire into the valley. Each pull was a heartbeat. Each heartbeat was permission to move. They charged the ridge under the veil of the machine's anger. Men who would have been counted as corpses were now shadows diving through the spray of bullets. Ross kept the rhythm, feeling the machine's hiccups and pushing it to speak again. He wrapped the line around a second branch, cast it forward, pulled, and the gun barked with renewed appetite. That bark turned motion into momentum. The enemy's carefully laid arcs of fire folded as if someone had redrawn the map mid-battle. Shells pounded nearby. A mortar nicked the soil behind Ross and threw him forward into mud. He tasted iron and grit and did not think about the cost. The firing slowed. The gun steamed and choked as dirt and heat fought inside its barrel. Ross crawled, reached, rethreaded. He jammed a bayonet into the trigger mechanism to wedge it clean, improvised a shim with a strip of canvas from his pack. He muttered, not prayers, but calculations born of instinct, leverage, timing, the angle to pull that would trick a machine into obedience. The trick wasn't witchcraft. It was mechanics and patience and the kind of bad decisions that bend luck. When the gun finally roared again, it wasn't merely a sound, it was an order. It told fear to move. The Rangers surged with it, the Germans, thinking themselves under a heavier barrage than reality allowed, pulled back into cover and then scrambled to find their bearings. Panicked commands, shouted in guttural syllables, cut off one by one as the defenders lost cohesion. In the gap created by the gun's phantom presence, men moved like tidewater, washing the line forward. By the time the ridge was taken, the machine lay like a sleeping beast, smoking and warped, its feed tray jammed with mangled belts and the residue of 100 rounds. Ross sat against a tree, ribs heaving, blood and mud mapped across his uniform like a second geography. Around him, men were shaking hands, slapping backs, laughing in the startled way of those who survive. Nobody spoke of forbidden things. Nobody had to. The setup, wire pry, the phantom pull was understood without being named. Word travels fast in war. Soldiers pass stories with the same urgency they pass ammo. Within the week, other Rangers were seen dragging strips of comm wire and the odd bolt and screw assembly to the edges of fight setting, improvised trip lines and remote pulls where they could. Some called it genius, others called it cheating, command called it unauthorized. To the men on the ground, it was a new blunt instrument in a fight where blunt instruments sometimes mattered more than doctrines. The trick acquired a name that made commanders frown, Ross's forbidden trick. The name made it more desirable, like contraband sweets in a ration. Months later, winter pressed against the front with a gray hand. Snow drummed at the helmets and shells turned earth to shoveled ice. In a shattered village outside Aachen, the Rangers found themselves funneled into a street that was not a street but a killing corridor. Houses were blown to ribs, windows were black eyes. German machine guns watched down laneways like vultures. Men moved slow, measured by the bullets that would not forgive a single misstep. Ross unrolled wire again. He stepped into forbidden work with the casualness of a man who has learned to treat rules like tools, useful sometimes, unnecessary at others. He fed the wire through cobbles, looped it into a derelict MG that had been left leaning against a wall, a rusting reminder of a time when things were simpler between enemies. He tied, he bent, he coaxed life into metal that had no right to speak. He coupled the pull to the length of his sleeve so that a tuck and a twist could send the gun into spasm. He practiced the movement with his hand as if it were a dance step. He pulled. The machine erupted, sending lead along the street in a spray that forced heads down and bodies into motion. From windows, defenders flinched, misread the assault, and for a wild minute believed the attackers had hidden a nest in the rubble. The illusion held long enough for the Rangers to cross the kill zone and take the houses on the far side. It had always been the trick's cruel grace to make the enemy misjudge even for the breath of a soldier's life. After the war, stories softened. Reporters liked headlines that figured men into neat tales of heroism, and the forbidden elements were trimmed back into anecdotes about bravery. But the men who had been there remembered the edge, the moral gray that had let them bend the machine's will. Some kept their coils of wire like talismans. Others kept them because they could not let go of a habit that had saved them. Dustin Ross kept his coiled in a drawer, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that smelled faintly of tar and gasoline. He said little about it in years when men were supposed to settle down into wives, jobs, and quiet. He worked a bench in a small town, tinkering with radios and tractors, always moving his hands in the patterns of someone who had learned to make things obey. The trick was forbidden, not because it was cruel, but because it refused to be neat. It blurred the line between machine and man, between sanctioned action and invention born from desperation. Commanders disliked it because it could not be scheduled into logistics. Politicians disliked it because deeds not on orders complicated stories. But to a ranger with men breathing down his neck and a valley full of teeth aimed at his friends, forbidden seemed just another word for necessary. Years later, on a night when the snow fell soft over that small town and the radio played music too sweet for the rough edges of his memory, Ross sat by the window with the coil in his lap. He remembered the texture of the wire, the way it threaded in his fingers, the precise pull that made the machine sing. He remembered faces, men who laughed too loud after long knocks on death's door, boys who would not grow older. He remembered the look in their eyes when the ridge fell, and how movement, even movement borrowed from a machine, had felt like rescue. He told the tale rarely, and then only to those who had been close enough to know that truth is not always dressed in orders. He said once, to a recruit who asked why he did it, because sometimes the book tells you to wait, and what you need is a push. The recruit looked at the coil like it was a weapon or a cure. It was both. Forbidden had a taste, Ross knew. It tasted of mud and smoke and survival. The forest where the trick had first sung would later be a place people walked with their children, not knowing the score of metal and wire that had once turned its leaves into a curtain for life to move through. Names fade from plaques, deeds get footnotes in longer books, but the moment when one man decided that a dead machine could be woken when he wrapped wire around a trigger and chose motion over stillness remained in the bones of those who carried it out. It was not glory. It was not doctrine. It was the small, sharp decision to refuse the silence that took so many good men. Dustin Ross aged like an instrument whose strings kept being tuned. He lived his days among ordinary machines,